All right. With that, everyone, I'm going to begin. So today's session is on Microsoft 365 strategy and success, practical tools and techniques. Now, this session is going to be pretty fast-paced. So if we think of the sprint part of the marathon, that's what this is going to be. So I hope you are as excited as I am to go through this material. There's a lot to cover. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a lot of concepts to you with the intention for you to have homework or some follow-up things that you're going to have to explore on your own. With that, why don't we just get started? Myself, I'm Richard Harbridge. I've put my information in the announcement panel, but just in case you don't have it, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. R Harbridge is the sort of username that I use pretty much everywhere, or you can just Google me and find me that way, or Bing me. And the main thing that I'm focusing on is being generous and helping people. So most of my work is on strategy and road mapping and planning things with customers. And I work in a company that has a whole lot of other MVPs and very smart people, much smarter than myself, that can provide a lot of insights. So one of the things I do recommend is for me to be prescriptive and to give you advice or guidance, whether you're working on helping customers with these kinds of problems or whether you are a customer and you're trying to figure out these things internally. Please do not hesitate to reach out because I'd love to have a conversation. So with that, why don't I start to dig into the actual content? The focus here is to really give you more confidence. A lot of us, when the way we work with these technologies on a daily basis, we're sometimes uncertain of, are we doing the right thing? Are we approaching it the right way? And one of the problems is, while you can get some technical domain knowledge quite easily, it can be hard to understand, how these pieces fit together. So I'm going to kind of tell you a bit of specific examples and patterns today, and I hope that they'll be useful for yourself. And we're good? Yep, okay. So with that, I'll move on to the 3 or 4 sections we're going to cover. Aligning with the Microsoft strategy overall is something that we're going to talk about. We're also going to talk about aligning with your industry. So to start, let's talk about aligning with industry, because there's really just 2 points I want to make here. If I had an hour, I could easily talk for an hour about industry trends that are very important. The big ones that I want to stress right now is that if you're in IT, right, or IT adjacent, and you're supporting these digital technologies like Office 365 and Microsoft 365, then the emphasis from C-level executives, so if you talk to the CEO, the CFO, you talk to other business leaders, what they want is what's in these top buckets here. They want transformation, they want expansion, so net new service lines that they're delivering externally through digital technology. They want to optimize, they want to see real improvements in terms of making things easier. There's a lot of specific things that they want to see. Most of those have nothing to do with firefighting or supporting the ongoing struggle that we all experience. And the reality is that's where IT spends all its energy and focus. If you were to ask a CIO or an IT director or some other IT person where they spend most of their time and where they think they need to spend more of their time, this is the dichotomy, this is the challenge, the issue that we often experience. And so what's really important here to stress is that you don't want to be the kind of IT person, or again, IT adjacent person, that focuses on these bottom areas, the firefighting and support, or certainly not the struggling spaces. You really want to emphasize your time and energy and all the things that you're going to drive into the transformation, expansion, and optimization categories. And the way you do this is by creating new opportunities for yourself by delivering new types of value in the organization. So I'm going to give you some tips and tricks today that hopefully make this a little bit easier to move up, this sort of value chain in terms of the way the business values the work and leadership that you can provide. The second thing I want to use as a broader industry discussion is this concept of sort of employee sat versus customer sat, and something else that I'll talk about in a second. Now, most of you have dealt with customer effort scoring in the past, perhaps, if you're in the marketing space. If you've never been in marketing, that's okay. Essentially, everyone knows what customer sat is. It's a lagging indicator to determine if a customer is satisfied with your organization, your product, your service. Whereas customer effort is essentially how hard is it to engage or to use that service or to purchase that service or whatever it is, or the product, etc. And so customer effort score is a predictive or leading indicator, and customer sat is a lagging indicator. And there is no question in the marketplace, customer effort score is way more important than customer sat. Not that customer sat's not important, but customer effort score is strategically more valuable because of the way it gives you increased insight and more prediction. And this is the same sort of pattern we see within our own organizations. We have employee sat, which is the lagging indicator, and we have employee effort score. And employee effort score is really quite interesting as a concept because really all you're saying here is we want to make it easier. In fact, one of the large pharmaceuticals that I work with, 150,000 people plus, they actually have a group within their business called the Making It Easier group. That's literally the organizational unit that essentially focuses on these employee effort score projects that drive employee effort score in the positive direction. And so if you think of making it easier, that could be integrating, that could be facilities-based projects back when we were in offices, that could be things like digital improvement and business process optimization projects, and many more things like that. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, we're in the middle of COVID, so yes, it's useful to know that we should be focusing on transformation and optimization and things like that. And yes, it's really great to see the ideas of employee effort score, but is that really something that I should focus on? And let me be 100% crystal clear. During a recession, which is what we're in, and during a prolonged recession, which is most likely what's going to occur, sorry for the bad news, the employee satisfaction numbers are important, but they're not the same priority for a business because you have a deluge of potential people that want to work with you as a company. Instead, making it easier, essentially making it easier to do more with less and be more competitive is far more strategically important. So the way we want to tailor, temper, frame, align our KPIs, our objectives, our measures, all these things that we're doing needs to be way more focused on employee effort scoring than the traditional employee satisfaction. And this is not a new concept. This has been around for many years now. It's evolving in the marketplace. So just, some homework for you to go and explore yourself, or like I said, set up a one-on-one and we can dig into this in deeper detail. One other piece of information I wanted to kind of leave with you is that the average spend for IT is shifting quite substantially. So if you look at technology spending, it was about 3.1% in 2024 increase for IT operational spending, but over 50% increase in line of business. And line of business spending already is very significant. What does this mean? It means the business is paying for the work that you want to do. That's where the dollars are. And I hear people say, well, how come we can't get, we want to do this project and we want to run Power Platform solutions, and we want to do this, and we want to do that, and we keep running into these barriers. Well, the problem probably with a lot of that is you're not going to the business and coming up with business alignment and business opportunity. So I'll talk about that a bit in today's discussion, but it's a really huge opportunity space. And if you're not into the Power Platform space, this is why Power Platform, Power Apps, Power BI, Power Automate are so strategically important right now. You all should have some understanding of these technologies because that's where huge marketplace momentum is happening. All right, so that's aligning with your industry. Sorry, it was really quick. You'll find a lot of these bits are. Remember, all the slides are available online. So if any point in time you're not sure or you can't remember, just go watch the recording or go grab them online. So aligning with Microsoft. Microsoft itself, or Office 365, has a roadmap. The Microsoft roadmap allows you to do some quick filtering, like what's new in the last week, what's new in the last month. So while it may be daunting initially understanding what's in the roadmap and understanding, all these things in development, rolling out, et cetera, it's something that we all have a responsibility to understand. And the reason we need to have this responsibility, if you're at a strategic level, you need to understand it because you don't want to waste dollars and money on things that are coming later, right? We don't want to create conflict with Microsoft. Another example of this is if you're, in the weeds and you're working on stuff, you want to find out what's coming that you can take advantage of. What's the stuff that you can kind of start to seed and prepare people for that's going to really help in the near future. And so there's a lot of great insights here in the roadmap, and arguably a lot of the sessions and things we talk about is really just framing context around these roadmap items. But the roadmap's not perfect. There's things that are left out of it, and there's a place that you can actually go and get additional insight, and that's user voice. Now, there's a user voice per product, right? So if I look at SharePoint, or if I look at the user voice for Microsoft Teams, there's different categories. And what's great about the user voice is it actually outlines what the gaps are. Essentially, everything in user voice that isn't delivered in the roadmap means that it's a gap. There's a real pain that the industry is feeling around this need. They want to see this potential feature. And so I'm just going to alt tab here for a moment. I'm just going to show you how important and relevant this is, because it doesn't just tell you, some of the gaps, but it tells you what Microsoft's responding to, right? And how are they responding to these items? And so in many cases, these are being worked on, but what's really helpful as well is the comments. If you were to click into one of these, you'd see comments from the industry and other people in the community. And this can also be helpful because people might highlight workarounds and patterns. And generally speaking, it's your responsibility to perform a bit of due diligence when you're going to provide an answer to a business user, if you're a business analyst, or when you're coming up with the right architecture, whatever it is that you're doing, you need to understand what's in user voice as a double check before you go and create something custom, or before you go and do a workaround, because you may have to own the debt, the technical debt or the leadership debt, for lack of a better term, that you've created by doing it without doing that due diligence. I cannot name the number of times I work with customers where they're saying, oh, we're doing this. And I'm like, but that's been announced for like 6 months plus that Microsoft's going to close that gap and it's coming soon. Like, why did you spend all this effort here? And it's because they didn't know to look at the roadmap or user voice. Another key comment here is to understand that we need to understand out of the box first and foremost, whether you're an analyst or whether you're an information architect or whether you're a strategist, you need to understand these tools. And the lookbook is actually a really great place to start. So if you're not sure where to start, it's a pretty useful place to create samples and demo environments and things like that. So if you've never been inside of the lookbook address, you actually have a series of collections. And here's a good one that's a relatively new one that Microsoft created, which is sort of a crisis communication center. And maybe I want to play with this. I want to get a feeling for how they created this so that I can kind of create my own variant of it that's probably much better. To do that, I just add it to my tenant if I'm an admin, or I ask my IT to do this, and then I can play with it myself. And this goes true for even solutions where there's some custom web parts Microsoft's made that you can deploy in your own environment. So there's lots of really powerful ideas represented in these lookbooks, and I think it's a resource more people should utilize. Now, the lookbooks and those things are great, but there's also this other challenge, which is there's clear alignment with Microsoft that we need to do, where we need to modernize certain things, or we need to really adopt and embrace potential changes in the technology landscape. The very obvious one is we might move from classic SharePoint to modern SharePoint. So if you're familiar with SharePoint, that means using, something that's not 10 plus years old, which is what classic is. So that's one way to look at it. Another one that's very common that we see a lot nowadays is using Microsoft Search. So a lot of customers, what they're doing is they're using SharePoint Search, but they're not really maximizing or utilizing Microsoft Search. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to help our own organizations really shift towards using Microsoft Search. The number of ways that you can customize the search experience already is quite substantial. There's a lot more coming this year. And so if you haven't started to play with this, whether you're a developer, architect, analyst, I think it's something that you really need to explore. As an example, I'm surprised by how many people don't understand this concept that you see on the right, where essentially what we can do with our search results is our search results don't need to be, the name of the document, the address, and simple stuff. We can make search results now actionable. We can make them have trigger conditions, and we can integrate them with other systems. We can connect other systems and bring them into Microsoft Search, and then surface it everywhere from Bing to the Office experiences to SharePoint. And that's a really powerful and compelling story that we can create. And I think a lot more organizations need to leverage this. So yes, some of it is a bit technical, but it's something that is pretty easy to understand the concept. And these are called adaptive cards. And the idea is you can change the search experience so that you can have your own vertical. That's what these little sort of headings are. And then we can also have our own adaptive cards, and we can, there's a bunch of other things you can do as well. All right. So what am I really saying? I'm saying that we have a responsibility to kind of create a radar in our organizations. And maybe you are the radar in your organization, right? Maybe your organization's smaller and you essentially are looking everywhere, including these sessions, to get a sense of what's coming down the pipe that you need to manage. And kind of like the radar analogy, at some point this plane is going to land. And if we don't prepare the runway, if we don't prepare for its landing, we're going to have some pretty big consequences. So I think the radar analogy is quite useful to understand what should we prioritize now, what stuff we need to prioritize later. And this can be done with a shared group of people. You have 2 or 3 or however number of stakeholders, where you can do it with sticky notes. If you're in a physical environment, if you're virtual like we are today, you can do this with Planner. You can do it with, just literally edit the slide and kind of work through the slide deck itself. So I can just, edit the slide and tweak it. And, if you even want samples and stuff like that, I can give you it. The key concept is you have a sense of timing, right? This stuff is going to land very shortly. We really need to figure it out and land it now. We have to deliver it now. This stuff is coming soon. We can't really avoid it. It's circling. That means it's going to land. We just need to figure out more about it before we build out the sort of landscape for it to land on. And then lastly, there's stuff that we just need to consider, right? Stuff that is in flight. It's for considerations. A lot of AI patterns and things like that fit in that category. And that's something to consider. Now, when you do this in real world, the whole point of this is to avoid confusion of what is the most important stuff that you you can address. And when you do this as a shared exercise, that shared understanding that's developed where people, say, oh, I thought this was really important now because right now I'm feeling the need from the business on X, or I'm feeling because of COVID, we're really stretched for resources. And I think this is a great way to deliver more value, so on and so forth. So these are the dialogues you want to have happen. And unfortunately, they really don't happen enough. So, use this technique and some of the ideas that I've hopefully provided already as sort of ammunition to start that discussion. So that was aligning with Microsoft in our industry. I know it's fast paced. We're going to move on really quickly to planning and implementing for scale. Now, this is something that I think most people kind of understand, right? Oh, information architecture, I need to understand, how to pattern this. Right now, it starts in a few sites and more sites and more sites, or if you're familiar with teams, we have a bunch of different teams, and then those teams are very difficult to navigate. These are the issues of sprawl. So unmanaged sprawl means that it's difficult to navigate. It can be a security risk, right? There can be security leaks and risks like that. And the last sort of major risk here is around search, right? Now, I would argue the search one, if you embrace Microsoft Search and you understand how that functions with bookmarking and concepts like that, as well as how Project Cortex and other things are improving some of those experiences, you do default locations. Anyways, there's a bunch of stuff you can do there. I really think search is very solvable with the technology that's at play today. So I'm going to really emphasize these other two, security and the security boundaries and how is that managed. And then this other one, which is navigation. And navigation is a really big pain point that needs to be more effectively addressed by organizations today. And that's really where a lot of people feel the pain when you have sprawl and you have a lot of these spaces and sites. And so here's why this occurs, right? One of the main reasons this occurs is when you create a new SharePoint site, you actually use often the wizard. So you might go into the SharePoint experience, click new site, or you might go to Microsoft Teams and you might click new team. In both scenarios, what you're essentially doing is you're creating a space and you're only answering the description and the name, and maybe if you're lucky, a classification if you've enabled that feature for the site. But that's it, which is a huge gap. So for a lot of organizations, what we really need to take further is we need to ask some additional questions when we create these spaces. And that's honestly the magic for really good governance and pretty much everything that comes down the pipe for improving navigation, for improving permissions and reducing data leakage, to improving search and recovery and retention scenarios and so on and so forth. The way we do that is by asking a few extra questions. In the provisioning, you might ask, which department does this relate to? Which product? Does it relate to a customer? Does it relate to this business unit? When you ask these questions and people give those answers, we can then apply that information to that Microsoft team, that SharePoint site, whatever it is, and that becomes extremely valuable because it allows us to really connect those experiences. We can create, let me use a very simple out-of-the-box example. You could create just a request list, right? A SharePoint list, and the list has these fields, right? So it's just some extra columns in the list. And then you can redirect, by the way, the creation process for the SharePoint new and site and things like that. You can redirect them to your form or your page. So you essentially do that. And now every time someone creates a new site or they go through a request process on the internet, wherever it is, they're essentially just filling out this list. And when they do that, now we don't just have that historic insight, but we can start to template the sites, and Microsoft Teams templates are coming, right? SharePoint templates have been around for a while, site designs, etc. So we can actually really template and gear the site so that it's designed for the request that they had. Oh, this relates to projects. Oh, this relates to a department. Or the information management policies are automatically applied. Things like default metadata, which has been in the platform for years, can be automatically applied. So, hey, you said it's department equals human resources. Great. Every time you drag and drop a document in there, you create a news article, whatever it is you do in that site, it's going to be marked as department equals human resources. So every roll-up that we do, every search we do, that refiner or that roll-up capability will be filter capability is going to be available to us. These are huge benefits to end users for a slight change in the process, which is huge benefits to IT in that we now understand these places that have been created. And if you're doing a migration, you're essentially doing this exercise. You're documenting all the various attributes about these spaces, and you can use that yourself when you go and create these new sites. You can essentially backfill and create these wonderful site directory experiences with, filter and refine by department or things like that, and find all of the Microsoft Teams. Because trust me, if you've never used Microsoft Teams and you have 100 teams, it is not the best experience, right, for quickly filtering and finding the team that you want to participate in. And that's just one example. So yeah, I have got some slides in here. There's some more hidden slides as well that were published online if you're interested in these subjects. But it's a really, I cannot stress this enough. This is the main thing that customers need to get a really good grasp on. They need to take it further. Don't just do like a simple, request process. Really kind of build in that templating, build in value for the end user when they fill in and give you that information and show them how you're actioning it. You could have Power Automates on that list, right? That allow you to follow up and do lifecycle management. Anyways, there's lots that can be done quite easily here. Another information architecture pattern that we've seen is we've moved from hierarchical. I hope many of you have moved from hierarchical to a flatter structure. And so this is often driven with hub sites where we connect sites. And the easy way to describe this is, oh, well, you just take some subsites and you flatten them. You just move them into their own site collections. But what we know is that's not really always the case. It can be very problematic when you have custom permissions, and it's permissions that generally is the pain point here. When you've broken inheritance and you have a customized set of permissions, you need to pattern that and understand why is that pattern of permissions broken? Is that something that we want to keep and maintain? And do we move that into this new flat structure or not? So there's tools using PowerShell and other techniques you can use to get a sense of when are they not using the sort of core members, right, and owners groups, because those map very well to the new paradigms of Microsoft Teams. But if they have visitors or if they have specialized groups beyond that, those are all risks that need to be evaluated when we remap the information architecture. So site structure and security is a really big deal. Now, hub sites themselves are pretty easy to pattern and plan. And I'm going to be the first person to say, if you're under 200 seats, 200 users, it is totally possible that you have one hub site today. Right, it's your global nav, essentially. Your hub nav is your global nav, and you have everything associated with one hub site because you only have so many hundreds of sites. But when you're in the thousands or even 500, 200 plus users, you typically really need to start thinking about using hubs as a way to organize these sites a little bit more effectively, especially as it relates to experiences, as it relates to information management and some other techniques. Some of these are built in, like the enterprise search scenarios where it scopes the search based on hubs. Some of it is just easier, right? So if you want to have a roll up for all of your project sites and you have a project hub, well, that's a lot easier because you just literally choose, all the sites in this hub roll up here, right? Versus on the, on the events or on the news control on these web parts, instead of manually doing it. Again, there's nothing you cannot do with just manual intervention or scripting or programmatic execution that the hub sites do. It's just the hub sites are really helpful for streamlining a lot of those processes. Another great example of this is the pattern with Microsoft Teams, where we start with a project A, we have a project A/B team, we have a project B team, and we have a project A private. And so a lot of times what people have is they have a project A team and a project B team. And what we get is a request or a need to create a new team. And the new team is, I want to share something between project A and project B. So that means we need to create essentially a new space. And this is one of the things that contributes to this sprawl issue. Another great example of this problem at play is that for a lot of organizations, this is also very problematic for private. So if I have a subset of project A and I want to have a subset of access, then we often create what are called private channels, which also creates a SharePoint site collection on the back end. And there's a bunch of governance and other things that you need to think about when you pattern it this way. So yes, if you're sharing content between project A and project B, you should create project A/B. That is the right information architecture pattern. But it's really important to understand that this further emphasizes the importance of, even in these project A/B scenarios, for that to go through a request process so you can understand which projects it relates to, et cetera. So eventually, if you decommission project A and project B, you can determine if project A/B should be removed, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of considerations here that are relevant. And again, they should just further stress that provisioning and baseline lifecycle management that you need. And you don't need a third-party tool to do these things. There are third-party tools that can make it easier. Or you can, again, just use PNP or other sort of free resources as a starting point and build from there. All right, I want to talk about another key concept here. And this next key concept is proactive planning for estimates and roadmaps. And the idea here is, for a lot of people in the workspace, when I work with them, I find that they don't do the best job of summarizing the many things that they're working on or the plans that they're putting into play. And this is a surprising thing to me. So here's the pitch. I believe fundamentally, and not just because I've done a lot of these, but it is much easier than I think people realize to create a good roadmap. A good roadmap for the digital workplace, a good roadmap for your intranet, a good roadmap for a particular technology that you want to roll out for Power BI or self-service BI or whatever your language is. It is easy to build these things if we're doing some really simple stuff, if we're understanding the nature of the business and the pain points, and if we're defining those as some sort of baseline recommendations. I'll come back to this, but I want to stress that this can be achieved with very minimal resources, even yourself alone. You can totally create roadmaps. And I think that's the idea here, is that I want to kind of seed that and then show some ideas of why that might be more tenable. So first, let's talk about roadmaps. They can be intimidating. When you see a really good roadmap, this one was a roadmap for an intranet a few years back, you might say, oh, well, this roadmap looks really great. Well, all roadmaps have the same concept. Roadmaps have phases at the top, right? Ways in which we can zoom in and explore some of the particular projects or recommendations we have. They might have milestones. Milestones can be really helpful for understanding, what are those key points, especially for tracking progress on the roadmap. Did we hit this milestone? Are we behind on this milestone? Those are really useful. Timelines are very important in a roadmap. If a roadmap doesn't have a real time scale, then it is not a roadmap. It's just a bunch of ideas essentially thrown into a board. If you have a time scale, what you're saying is this is conveying at least a degree of difficulty, a degree of practicality. We think we can achieve this within this time frame. And especially once you start to zoom in, you really get a better sense of how things line up, what dependencies might exist, and so on and so forth. So it's a really great visual tool that essentially ensures you can't make a roadmap if you haven't done some of the thought processing that you need to do, right? It's really difficult to make a roadmap if I haven't been specific with my recommendations, or if I don't know enough about the amount of effort it's going to take to accomplish some of the things that we're looking to do. So roadmaps are a really good test or a way to validate that you actually do have a plan and that your plan is actionable, because a roadmap absolutely should be actionable. It shouldn't be abstract ideas. These are clear recommendations. I'll come back to that. This doesn't need to be limited, or it doesn't need to have milestones. It doesn't need to have, a million phases. If you want to make something simpler and you're just focusing on a technology rollout like Power BI, then make a roadmap for Power BI and talk about the technology, the operational, the governance, the training and adoption, the various aspects of planning that you need to do for Power BI. And everything that you see here absolutely is pretty common. If you roll out Power BI in any organization, these are the things you typically do, right? And the reason that we're communicating these things in a roadmap is because then we can determine, did we achieve this? Oh, you know what? We didn't do data gateways. We had this great idea. We know the value of data gateways, but we're going to have to do that next quarter. So we'll have to figure out some other way to move things around and make that happen. It's also a great way to communicate back to the business. Remember that earlier comment, we need to be transformative. We need to be optimizing. Well, roadmaps are how we do that, right? They get us away from thinking of firefighting, hopefully, although yes, lots of these things might be firefighting items, but they move us more and more towards proactive planning. So where does this start? I mentioned that this can be easier than a lot of people recognize it to be. So the first thing that I would note is pain points are really helpful. If someone can tell you the various pain points, or the pain points in the organization, document them in user stories and pain points, bullet points, I don't care how. As long as you document them, you can take action on them. And what you're doing is you're essentially taking the pain point and you're mapping it to some sort of recommendation. Okay, so the pain point was we didn't really have guidance for people on, we have people using Power BI, but there's no guidance on how to use Power BI when it's used in the authoring process versus say, SQL analysis services or Azure analysis services or whatever else you're using in your organization. Okay, we have a recommendation because we understand the domain, right? We have the domain knowledge and we have a sense of the timing. It's immediate, near term, or ongoing. That's all you really need, right? Once you have a sense of timing and you have a recommendation, that can go on to a roadmap. And really what a roadmap is just eventually, instead of having like 50 recommendations all written on a roadmap, you just simplify them by categorizing, a bunch of these governance recommendations together and say, release 1 or baseline of our governance will be implemented by this date. And that will, be 5.1, 5.4, whatever, right? It's the same idea. You're just saying, hey, we're going to do these recommendations in this time frame. Now, you might be saying, well, that's great. And it gives us a sense of timing. And yes, that's all you need. But a lot of us get hung up on taking it further. We have these user needs and we have ideas of how to solve them with solutions, but we really don't understand the business value or we don't understand the complexity. And that's fair. That's a really good problem to have, because both of those are also very easy to tackle. For business value, there's lots of ways to evaluate that. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through them all, but there's definitely ways that you can add a value to something and say, well, generally speaking, if we solve this user need, it's going to be this valuable. And complexity is something that you can either have the domain knowledge for, or you can reach out to friends for that domain knowledge, whether it's services companies like Tutorlead ourselves, or whether it's other partners in the ecosystem or Microsoft or the community. There's lots of people who would be happy to help you understand like how much work it would take to do X. And when you start to put that together, you can call it Moscow analysis or whatever, but you start to really get a sense of what you should prioritize. And those are the things really that you want to emphasize and put on the roadmap, right? Because not a priority probably never even makes into the roadmap. Same thing with like considerations. Remember, it's like our radar. It's not something we need to build the tarmac for right now for it to land. Another problem that we see a lot is that people say, okay, I can come up with a business value and complexity. And you might say, awesome, Richard's been saying this is super easy. I'm going to go, whip this together and create my own roadmap. And I love it. Please do. But do understand that there are lots of little hidden patterns and mistakes people make. So I'm going to pick on one because it's pretty easy to understand and it's memorable. And that is that often, and in this example on the left, you can even see it, we're giving a single value. The business value is 7. The complexity is a 3. It's 3 days, or it's, X dollars. And that's great, but it's missing something very fundamentally important. It's missing a range. Let me explain this concept, right? The value in the difficulty is what we're always trying to figure out. It's 8 difficulty, it's a 6 in value, or it's a 4 in value. It's a 2 difficulty, it's a 3 value. Each of these things can quickly give you a sense of how much benefit something is going to provide. That goes back to this bottom right quadrant, right? We're prioritizing these things because they're relatively low effort, complexity, and they're relatively high value. And so if that's the model that we need to use, what I'm going to caution you on is using a single value. So here's what happens. You're working on an internet project or something else, and you reach out to a colleague and you say, how long is X going to take you? How long is it going to take you to build, that Microsoft search experience that we were working on? Oh yeah, let me think through this. So they think about it, and then they tell you a number. They say 6 hours, right? And the problem with this is they've thought through a ton of different things in their head, but they haven't communicated it with you. And because you hear 6 hours, if you take that, then you're really running a bit of risk. And so now what do you do? Do you buffer that? Do you, how do you predict it? How do you manage it? This can be a really big pain point. And this gets exacerbated when you take something like business value and you have a range of business value in someone's head, but it's not communicated. The same sort of thing goes for difficulty, right? As general senses like X days. So what you have to remember is if you ever get a single number, if someone on your team says, I think it's going to take this long, or I think it's, this valuable, or I would give it some measure like X, stop for a moment and ask the simple question, is that like your low and high? What would be your low and high value? I'd like to record that. And when you ask that question, you change the dynamic. So instead of them saying 6, now you get a sense of the range. If it's 2 to 8, that's pretty reasonable, right? If they say, no, it's like 4 to 6, that's even better, right? The range is getting narrowed. That suggests that their confidence is higher, right? And that's really great. If someone says, hey, I don't know, it's between 2 and 8 days, maybe 10 days even, well, then we've got a big gap, right? Because now that clearly communicates that they don't have enough information. From a variety of places, the technical complexity might need, POCs or different types of research to be done, or it could be that they don't have enough information because the requirements are well defined, or it could be that literally they just don't know because they don't have enough time to think about it, and so you need to give them more time. Any of these scenarios are positive outcomes where by asking, hey, why is it such a big range? Or, hey, what if we do this? If I remove these requirements, what would that do to these number of hours or number of days, et cetera? And then you start to see the ranges shrink. Or if I said, look, I'll get you this information, would that allow you to, better give me a new number at this point in time? And so this is a really important concept. I can't stress enough. I believe contracts, this is obviously something we champion in our own company, but anytime you work with anyone in any arrangement, you should always be saying, look, it's going to be a range, because that's what it is. There's always variance, right? And quite frankly, it's important for us to communicate that variance because it has so much insight within that variance. And if you combine that with what we talked about before, and we get a sense of business value variance, well, that's even better, because now we can say, look, even if it's a 4 to a 7, and we just assume the 4 and the high complexity rating, and it's still a high priority, right? It still fits in that bottom right corner, then you're really golden. You know that you need to do that motion. Whereas there, it'll help you understand what is that gray area, and maybe there's some simple motions, simple activities, exercises, and things you can do internally that will really help narrow those numbers and give you, the efficacy to make those prioritization choices. So anyways, a quick digression there, but really important to think about estimates as numbers like that. The next thing to think about here is that the framing of a roadmap and how you communicate it doesn't need to be extremely challenging. I'll give you an example. For some users and organizations that we work with, we actually will build a roadmap even though we're only doing this little project. And the reason we do that is because we need to have an idea of how that project fits in with everything else. And more importantly, we need to communicate to a customer how those relate. So you can do this internally yourself. If you're in a IT or adjacent to IT and you have this opportunity, you can say, look, let me just try my best. It's not going to be a great roadmap, right? But I'll do at least something. And honestly, most of the times this something that you put together, this quasi roadmap, is something that other leadership and other people really buy into. They really like it and they start to champion it. And then it takes on hopefully a life of its own where you actually have more time, budget, effort, and support to actually really flesh this roadmap out. But starting to think about, these recommendations, these things we want to do, and putting them into a roadmap, even if it's just something you're whipping together, is a much better way of communicating these concepts. And these are the things that unlock budget, especially if you're working with a business. This can be a really great way to manage and work on expectations, because remember, typically by the time we get to phase 2, we haven't done everything in phase 1, which we've all experienced. And so that can be a good trigger point to say, well, can you, provide more funding, and then I can have a dedicated headcount person to focus on this, or whatever it is, or we can outsource and get some support to do this. All right, so that's proactive planning and estimates. Now I want to talk about visualizing and communicating better. And again, all the slides are available online. You can go and grab them afterwards. The first one I want to talk about is personas. Now, personas have been used in the industry for a long time, and personas are pretty helpful. They help us come up with user journeys and narratives. They help us define scenarios and apply those scenarios, even user stories, right? We have ways of using it as a sort of an organizing factor to make sense of it, to rationalize it, and so on and so forth. So personas have been things that a lot of our customers, they might call them profiles, but they've created them. The problem is they don't use them. I cannot name how many projects we've had in, say, digital workplace strategy or something, or intranet or something like that, where we build great personas and then they're not used when we roll out Microsoft Teams or something else. And this is a gap because the persona is a good mechanism to think about a collection of users, a representation of your user base. And I think a good example of where maybe IT can better leverage personas is to really challenge yourself and think about what is the current state of technology usage of this persona. Yes, there's going to be variance. Hey, low and high numbers, make 2 colors on the graph, right? Show low and high, that's fine too. But start to communicate where we think people are today and the technologies that they're using and where we want them to be. And this is a great way from the very beginning, from the envisioning or the definition of user stories and other types of requirements, to actually map this into your future state, to map this into the adoption that you're trying to drive and things of that nature. Another good example here, if we take it a step further, is the concept of card sorting. So a lot of you may have even used card sorting in the past, and I'm surprised at how many people don't use it as much as they could within Office 365. So I'm going to talk about some patterns for card sorting. First, let me just make sure everyone's on the same page. Card sorting is essentially 2 forms of card sorting. There's open card sorting and there's closed card sorting. So here, as an example for open card sorting, is I just give you a bunch of these cards, you organize them into 2 categories, and you say, look, I've got cars and pets. I give it to another person, and then they do the same exercise and they organize it into cute, scary, domestic, etc. And so that's fine, right? That tells me the outcome that I'm looking for is what are the categories people are thinking of. And this can be extremely helpful for things like determining topics. In fact, the way topic computing essentially works, yes, there's more to it because it's looking at behavioral analysis and other stuff, but essentially topic computing, which is what Project Cortex is essentially doing this kind of exercise. It's sorting things and figuring out, hey, I think this applies or it's related to this item. And so if you're rolling out something like Project Cortex, or you're trying to figure out what's the metadata in your organization, or you're trying to figure out what types of sites, what types of teams do we have so that you can improve those provisioning processes that we talked about earlier? Card sorting is a great way to do it. Take the 200 or 800 or whatever number of sites you actually have, put them, print them out, put them in a tool, a card sorting tool, and then just move them around and start to categorize them. And you'd be surprised at the kind of insights you can get around how people organize this stuff. Or do closed card sorting. You create the categories and you ask people to put them where you want. Some people might see, well, I don't know how many people would, but let's pretend someone saw Ferrari as a regular and someone saw Honda as a luxury, right? When people do those changes, you can say, oh, these items are a bit confusing, right? If we add them to these topics, we'll make sure that we add them to these other topics, right? If you think of navigation, it's the same idea, right? Navigation is something that really benefits from a design perspective by using card sorting techniques. And so does metadata, and so does things like the ones that we were talking about, topics and concepts like that. When you combine card sorting with a really powerful tool called mind mapping, you really start to get some great synergy. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're building out your new nav, or you're optimizing your nav, something that we all have to do, and you're changing your mega menu structures and things like that. Well, this is a great opportunity to engage and say, hey, let's talk through this visually. Okay, so you have a link here and you're saying, no, oh, there's confusion. We have travel and expenses, and the travel expenses we think should live in finance and accounting, but a lot of people look for them in human resources, and human resources says that they want it there. So why don't we create a link there? Why don't we make a very prominent and clear space for it? Why don't we create bookmarks if there are different hubs and things like that? Why don't we apply different bookmarks and rules so it's easier to find that content from Microsoft Search? So you come up with all these simple recommendations based on this dialogue that you're having, and because you're using mind maps, it's a really easy thing for people to grasp. As you're talking through it, no one loses track of where they are within the navigation model, right? The same sort of thing goes when you think of site structures. We think of Microsoft Teams and what are the channel structures and substructures. You can use the same sort of analogy there. So here's an example. I know it's an eye chart with SharePoint, right? Where we can start to think about the team structures and the SharePoint structures at play. You can do the same thing with Microsoft Teams. And this can be really, really helpful because it really starts to create this discussion of, is the site structure, is the structure of Microsoft Teams, the channels, et cetera, is that doing what we want it to do? I'll give you another quick sort of tip that we find very helpful. Another one is when you're in a meeting, so we're in Microsoft Teams meeting right now where I'm communicating to you. Normally in a Microsoft Teams meeting, if this was a one-on-one or one-to-few, I would end this, I would have a discussion with you, you'd be talking, right? And I would ask things like, oh, okay, well, tell me about your current state. So like, how do you conduct meetings today? Oh, we typically organize a pre-call, blah, blah, blah. So when I take these notes, what I'm doing here, and I know this sounds very simple, but I cannot express how important this is. When you remove the pictures of the people and the focus on audio, and you start to have something on the screen, like just you typing some notes, it focuses everyone on those notes. It focuses people on the things that are being discussed. And there's real behavioral science that shows that this is what happens. So anytime you're in any meeting and all you see is the heads, or and I mean, we're not talking about like water cooler talk. If you just see talking heads, or you just see those little bubble, right, of people, because often people aren't showing their videos. If we have those scenarios happening, share your screen, share OneNote, share the slide deck that you're about to talk about and take some notes in there. Wherever it is, start to take some visual notes. Use mind maps and take some visual notes in mind mapping as both an exercise to teach you how to better use it, and more importantly, to keep everyone on the same page. The reason that this is very valuable, even in the age where every meeting's transcript is auto-transcribed, right? Literally everything we say in this meeting, once we record it, the transcript can be created by Microsoft Stream automatically. It's great, but it's not the same as focusing people in the meeting itself, focusing people on outcomes. One more example here. Let's say we're talking through and I take some notes, and that person, that one wonderful person, brings up the kitten picture rotator again. They say, we're really, this is important, guys, but what's really important? The kitten picture rotator. And so if you've noted that previously, you can say, oh yeah, John, yep, it's the kitten picture rotator. Got it. So it's important. Is there anything else you want to talk about there? And so what often you can actually do is you can control and avoid a lot of this wasteful time and exercise, et cetera, in a meeting by just having some visual notes. One last thing about visual note taking, because I've been trying to champion things like, oh, create a little roadmap, do things like that to really elevate your position and authority and visibility within the organization. Here's another really powerful trick. If you're actually in a meeting and you start to take meeting notes, Especially you can practice this, maybe don't do it right away, practice taking visual notes without sharing your screen and see if you can keep up with people. But again, you're not typing everything they're saying, you're just typing the key concepts. What's really helpful is that really focuses people. So sometimes a person can be talking for a long time, and I'm sure you've been in this scenario. And so as they're talking, the person who's taking the notes might just kind of pause for a while, right? And they're not really sure what to do. Or they'll say something and then they'll kind of zoom up and they'll kind of zoom down and they'll try and figure out where it is. That's a visual cue that at least one person, probably a couple people, aren't really paying enough attention or don't quite understand what this person's talking about and how we can action it. And so what's really helpful about focusing on notes is you could add structure to it. So you could do something really simple, like in a slide deck, have a slide near the end for action items or whatever, or you can just call out the word action. And what happens here, you can use an at mention, right? This of course works as well. So I can do an at mention and reference one of my coworkers. When you start to do this sort of idea, you're actually changing the dynamic in the meeting to really emphasize the outcomes that you're trying to drive, not just this shared understanding that we're all trying to develop, but the actions. Again, this cannot be expressed enough how significant of an impact this can have. So just essentially, when you're sharing your screen, when you're having a meeting and you don't see a screen shared, take the initiative and be that person to really organize the meeting and make it more successful by doing some shared note taking. And you'll find you'll learn more, you pay more attention in the meeting. There's lots of benefits that will come from that. I want to end with a key concept. We do a lot of demonstrations. If you're a business analyst, you do a ton of demonstrations. If you're a information architect or somebody who works with these technologies, you need to communicate to people how they work and why they work that way. And you do a lot of demos. And there's this chicken or egg problem, right? So do I demo first because they don't know what the technology does? Or do I ask them about their pain points and then do I demo based on those responses? Obviously, in a perfect world, you'd ask for the pain points, but sometimes people can't give you clarity of pain points. They kind of need to see what you're offering and then they can make sense of it and then give you, prescriptive guidance based on that. Like, oh yeah, that would really help in this particular scenario. So the trick here is if you're going to demo in any circumstance, again, it's better to demo with richer understanding of the context and the domain. But if you don't have that, or if you're in any situation where you're demoing, the trick is how you demo. So let's do a simple example. Here we are. Actually, let me just do this one with you guys, might as well. So I'm just going to go to my OneDrive. In OneDrive for Business, what I'm going to do is I'm going to emphasize, come on, load up for me. You can do it. There we go. So in my OneDrive for Business, it's going to come this time. It's going to come. All right, I'll just do this manually. In OneDrive for Business today, when I POP, there we go. Brain works. So when we open up OneDrive for Business, there's two ways people could demonstrate, the basics of OneDrive. They could say, this is OneDrive for Business. If I click on the left here, I have different options. One of them is recent. When I click on recent, it shows various files and documents that I've recently been working on. So that's the simple analogy, that's the example. It's very different than saying, hey, this is OneDrive for Business. One of the things that's really valuable in OneDrive that we didn't have before in the file share world is this concept of recency. In fact, if I actually was to click on that, you would see all of the recent documents I've been working on. And this is useful because it actually shows and allows me to get back to content I worked on a few weeks ago. It allows me to quickly filter based on the type of document. There's lots of ways that I can use this. And so recent as an option here is valuable because it allows us to do something we couldn't do before with file shares. It's a new way of working, a better way of working. It saves us time, effort, so on and so forth. What I've done there is a really simple exercise. Instead of essentially just demonstrating or talking about the functionality, I've asked the question internally, so what? Okay, so there's this recent button. So what? Or, hey, it shows recent documents. So what? What's the value? Why does that matter? And when you do this to yourself in any meeting, it doesn't even need to be demonstrations. In any context, if you can expand just a little bit when you explain something, it has huge impact. So I used to take a sticky note and put it on my monitor. And when I was in calls and I would do demonstrations, which we all do, you'd be surprised at how many you probably do in a day. When you do a demonstration and you explain something, you often just need to look at it and say to yourself, did I expand on so what? Like, why did I just say you should do this thing? Did I say why? Did I, as I demonstrated this new functionality or this thing that Microsoft's rolling out or this thing I learned about at the virtual marathon, did I communicate why that's important? So this trick of so what and talking to yourself like that can be, especially once you've internalized it effectively, can be such a huge changer in the way that you demonstrate. So I hope these things were useful for you guys. It was pretty fast paced. I do have a lot of recommendations for next steps. There was a few links kind of hidden in the slides as we walk through it. We didn't have time to talk about adoption, but that's something that I'm very passionate about and our team has spent a lot of energy on. So you can feel free to read any of these white papers. The intranets one is over 100 pages. It's very extensive on everything around Microsoft 365 and Office 365. The campaigns one is essentially everything about adoption and how to tackle it for Office 365. These resources have like governance tools. So there's a questionnaire as an example that helps you understand whether a role or responsibility is effectively being filled, or which policy documents or sort of results of good governance you have or don't have. And those can actually be quite useful just as a simple exercise. Do we have some of these documents? Like, do we have a champion policy? Does our champion policy have these elements to it? No? Oh, then that's probably something we need to tackle and improve. So I hope you guys reach out and we have a discussion afterwards. With that, I'm going to walk through just the brief slides at the end about sponsorship and evals, and then I'm going to start to do a Q&A on the other panel here. So again, thank you to all the sponsors that supported this wonderful event. If you haven't taken a chance, please make sure that you participate in the raffle. I'm a big fan of charities and donations. However you like to do that, if you're looking for a cause, this is a good one to donate to support essentially the improvements from International Medical Corps for relief, especially with post-COVID. And then if you guys have questions or if you want to share feedback, I really appreciate speaker feedback, especially comments more than anything else. So I would really love to hear from you what you're looking for. But even better than that speaker feedback, because it may not give me your contact information, just send me an email or a note, and then we can actually have a real discussion one-on-one about it. So I'm going to take a look and see if there's any questions. And let's see. This organizes, there we go. Just the older question that was in there. I don't see any new questions, so if you do have any questions, feel free to post them. I'll take a look in the near future. But with that, I bid you guys adieu. For myself, I'm going to go make sure the kids are in bed. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. All right, so let's see while we're waiting. There's a new question. Oh, just another comment. Appreciate it, guys. Lots of positive comments on enjoying what was there. Still no questions. I can answer questions that were on previous sessions. How to get executive buy-in for pilot phases and things like that. Why don't we do something like that since I don't have another question? So, my quick comment on one of the very big problem areas is getting budget. So let me give you some quick tips. If you're doing a migration, one of the big problems with migrations is that you do an optimization effort with it. So if you're doing a migration, you have the technical work, and then you essentially have this sort of business optimization, information optimization work that you do. And when you have both those patterns, it can be really difficult to manage the project. As an example, when you put them together in one project, it's really going to stretch, right? Think of all the optimization work, the tax you pay every year in terms of knowledge management. Well, if you have a technical project that's just about the efficacy or the success of the technical migration, well, that's pretty manageable. The scope and costs and everything else are very easy to predict there, and they tend to be very successful. It's these information management or optimization projects that really have scope creep that's just insane. And they're very difficult to manage because you're reliant on different business stakeholders and things like that. So one of the simple techniques you could use is you could have business own those kinds of optimization efforts that you're doing on a regular basis from a funding perspective, and then and have a real sense of stakeholder equity in that, and then that generates a much more effective result, right? You have a really successful technical project, and then you have hopefully a long-winded or long process where there's additional funds and CRs and changes and things like that around, even $0 change requests are fine, around this model of improvement over time on information. And the other key trick that a lot of people struggle with is we used to have triggers like a new version of a server product. Now we don't have that, so you have to come up with your own trigger, right? That's why that proactive road mapping is so important. If we don't have a trigger for that extra investment in adoption or training or these information improvements like improving the nav, then you're in a difficult position because you're essentially behind the curve, and it's going to be very difficult for you to position that because you don't have the trigger of we're spending $1 million on all these new licenses. You don't have that when you're in a SaaS world, so you have to create that, and the roadmaps and things I've talked about today are definitely the way to do that effectively. So with that, I will sign off completely. I hope you guys have a great day.